Hello, BookTube. I've got a tiny bit of mail for you today on an overcast, very hot, very humid Tuesday. It is clearly a bunch of hot, humid air being pushed ahead of a front of some kind. So I would imagine that the half-hearted predictions of rain tonight or tomorrow are actually going to happen. I would imagine that's true. It's iniquitous in a way. It's not only is it 25 degrees too hot for October, that part I'm not complaining about, but the humidity means that you can't move outside without coming back like the Swamp Thing and needing to take a long scrubbing shower every single time. But I'll take it over winter. Although I saw an article in, I think it was Boston.com or something like that, saying, oh boy, after the hellscape of last year's winter, what will this winter hold in store? And I was thinking, the lengths that people will go to for clickbait. We had no winter in Boston last year. We had one storm. But I've got some mail, but I've also got some a little bit of catching up to do that I wanted to show you. I reread The Day of the Jackal by Frederick Forsyth. I could not actually manage to get all of the schmutz off the cover. I got some of it off. This was much better than I remembered. What a tautly done thriller. I just loved it. Thought it was fantastic. And I also read my very first Wycliffe mystery, The Scapegoat, which was also really, really good. This is a very standard Scotland Yard murder mystery with a very standard detective chief superintendent, you know, a very standard police investigator. Wycliffe is not, he's only marginally eccentric, at least in this book. He's only marginally eccentric, and the narrative throughout is also only marginally eccentric. Probably forgivable. Probably the writer was W.J. Burley, was really intelligent and well-read. The narrative, not Wycliffe himself, not any of the characters, just the narrative of the book, will often echo literature in non-cliche ways, so that you know that the author is thinking about a passage of literature when he's writing some description of action or a person. I found that kind of interesting. Definitely whetted my appetite for more. I definitely want to read now all of the Wycliffe mysteries. So that was also a success. But we don't have much in the way of mail. We have one periodical and one package. More might be coming, but so far that's all there is. The periodical is The New Yorker with an absolutely heartbreaking cover by Chris Ware. That is the cover. The title of it is called Lockdown. And it's grim. It's absolutely grim. I would imagine that this is going to so-called trigger quite a few New Yorker readers. I wouldn't be surprised if they get letters about this cover, and they almost never do get letters about covers. That's pretty awful. And the most awful thing about it is how incredibly accurate it is. Now, it is meant to go hand in hand with an article in here, a photo essay in here about waiting at the bus stop in Uvalde, Texas. That is largely just a collection. I'm going to show you. It's largely just a collection of photos of kids waiting at the bus stop in the pre-dawn hours in Uvalde, Texas. I cannot imagine that kind of bravery. And I can't imagine the kind of bravery of the parents who do this. In 2022, if I were a parent of a kid in grade school, I would never send them to school. If the state wants to make trouble with me, well, bring it on. Let the state make them safe. Then I'll do it. I think it's lunacy to send your kids into a big building with a gigantic target sign on it for every lunatic within 20 miles or 50 miles. This New Yorker covers, I'm kind of a connoisseur of them. I've loved them and studied them for the whole the time that I've known about the New Yorker, a very long time. And they often put their finger on the pulse of something in the zeitgeist. But the New Yorker editorial drift used to be that, sure, you can put your finger on the zeitgeist, but our cover can't be grim. It can't be negative. Every once in a while, that was accepted until there were exceptions made for that every once in a while, until I would say the thing that broke the dam there was 9/11, after which covers could be what this is, this is a beautiful New Yorker cover that is tragic. This is completely tragic. The only thing that would make it worse, the dramatic gesture that Chris Ware very wisely, he's a great artist, and he knew that he didn't need to add the one extra gesture, which would have been a silhouette in the doorway. He didn't need to do that, so he doesn't do it. He knows you'll do it. But that was arresting. I don't really come to the New Yorker to have grim tidings like that right off the bat. And the Uvalde, Texas piece is heart-wrenching as well, because this is America in 2022, when the senators, the only people who could make common sense gun reform laws, are owned by the gun lobby. The gun lobby has paid for them. They are owned creatures whose only goal is not to do that. So there is no solution here, and unless you start taking those people to court. They'll desert the gun lobby to save their own skin, but nothing else, not to save kids in their districts or their representatives. No, not at all. Which means that although those kids in the photo spread for Uvalde, Texas, are probably not going to go through another mass shooting, kids just like them are somewhere else, 40 miles away, 400 miles away. Anyway, that made a little bit of tough going in this issue of the New Yorker, but there were other things. So we'll go through some other things, including the letters page. The letters page can sometimes be of interest in the New Yorker. They have an editorial policy that I don't like. Maybe it's a financial policy. Their letters page looks like this, and it shouldn't. And the only reason it looks like this is because they're taking a huge amount of ad money to put this ad here from top of the page to bottom of the page. The closer you get to the beginning of the magazine, the higher the rate. So this is a large amount of money that City Harvest is paying, and the New Yorker should do without it. This should be a 3-page letter column. Instead, you've only got 2 columns. And an editorial decision seems to have been made that in that 2 columns, you will usually sometimes, more often than not, print 2 letters instead of the 20 or 30 or 50 that you get for every issue. I don't know why you would bother to have a letters column under those circumstances. And of course, for the longest time, the New Yorker didn't have a letters column. In fact, they went so long ostentatiously without a letters column that Spy magazine used to make fun of them for it and run letters to the New Yorker that the New Yorker wouldn't run. But it's not much better to have 2 letters per issue, no matter how thoughtful they are. Better by far to get rid of that top to bottom ad, put it somewhere else, and put it in the back of the magazine and expand the letters page to 3. But one of the letters was an example of something we've talked about on this channel before, which is the disastrous act of a writer writing in to object to a review by a reviewer. There is almost no circumstance in which that can be justified. I'm saying this to all of you, all of my fellow transphobe incels, but I'm also saying it to the authors who are listening, because I know at least 6 of you who are. There is never a good reason to do that. The one that comes closest is if you've caught the reviewer in a misrepresentation of an objective fact in your book. If the reviewer says that you say the American Civil War ended in 1870, and you didn't obviously make such a howler, then you can write in. You shouldn't write a letter for general publication, even in a circumstance like that. You should write to the newspaper, to the editor, not to the reviewer, to the reviewer's boss, the person who writes the check for the reviewer, and ask for an apology. Write a correction. You shouldn't write a letter in yourself taking the reviewer to task. There is never a good reason to do that. And yet, Jedediah Purdy does that in this issue. Now, number one thing, even if it's not a factual correction, as we're going to see, it's not, no matter what Jedediah Purdy thinks, it's not a factual correction. But even if it were, you don't do it if you got a 4-page review by Adam Gopnik in the New Yorker. That can only help you. It is only going to look like sour grapes if you complain about that. So, I don't know if you can hear, but the bean is going crazy over on the bed. And part of the reason she's going crazy is because she would like it if her going crazy was disturbing my filming. The only reason I'm not sitting on the floor and filming this on my bed so that you can see the whole wall of books is because every time I did that, she did this. She went crazy and caused the camera to bounce even more than it usually does. And so now I stopped that. She can't actually disrupt filming. She's trying her hardest. But anyway, I'm going to read you the letter that Jedediah Purdy wrote in reaction to a long review in the New Yorker. Only 1 or 2 authors a year. Oh my God. Only, 10, 15 authors a year get that? Anyway, I'd like to make a few modest corrections to Adam Gopnik's review of my recent book, 2 Cheers for Politics. Gopnik writes that I am, quote, disgusted with representative democracy in all its forms, close quote, and suggests that in its place I would like to see a manifestation of direct democracy of the sort inspired by classical Athens. Understandably, he has some misgivings, expressed with his usual style and elusive range. Well, Seymour, if you liked his style and elusive range, you'd zip it when he writes a review of your book in the New Yorker. But you obviously don't, so you obviously didn't. I don't think this. I discuss Athens to point out that direct democracy, as it usually is imagined, never existed there. That is a myth. Similarly, I draw on the example of Occupy Wall Street to show that representation is inevitable in politics, even in small, ideologically homogeneous groups. I argue that we should not contrast representative democracy with the imagined alternative of direct democracy, but should view modern politics as remarkably democratic and try to make it more so. The letter goes on. There are a few other issues. With his usual style and elusive range, there are a few other issues. Gopnik asserts that I don't take pluralism or disagreement seriously and proposes that the best quality of politics is that it can enable, quote, people to live together when their views differ, close quote. I agree with this and say so a number of times, emphatically, throughout the book. I don't claim that admission to Harvard is, quote, bought and sold, but that American meritocracy is structurally involved in deep inequality that undercuts both its own promise and democracy's. I don't propose that the Constitution should be rewritten, but that a Constitution is more legitimate when there are real and regular opportunities to amend it. I'm willing to chalk up these divergences from the text to rhetorical flourishes, but I would not want readers to finish the review believing that the main points of my book are what Gopnik suggests them to be. Number of problems with this letter. First of all, the things that Jedediah is pointing out are not what Gopnik refers to or characterizes as the main points of his book. They are merely observances made in the course of a glowing 4-page review. They are not Gopnik saying these are the main points of the book. That's point number one. And point number two is that I'm willing to chalk up these divergences from the text to rhetorical flourishes. Well, Jedediah, you haven't quoted the text. In all these cases, you have said, he says I said this, and I say just the opposite. He says I say this, but I don't. You could quote your own text to prove it. You say that you mention, what is it? You said at one point that you mentioned something many times throughout the text. Was it about representative democracy? I don't think this. I discussed Athens to point out that direct democracy, as it usually imagines, never existed there. I draw on examples to show that representation is inevitable in politics. No, okay, but there's at one point you mentioned that you say something throughout the text. Gopnik asserts that I don't take pluralism or disagreement seriously, and proposes that the best quality. I agree with this and say so a number of times, emphatically throughout the book. Okay, should be easy to find one of those times and quote it, but you don't. And most damningly of all, I also read your book. And I agree with Gopnik. And that's not an easy sentence for me to say. the takeaway, he's giving takeaways here. He's not quoting from your text. Although, the fact that admission to Harvard is bought and paid for, you quote, bought and sold. You put that three-letter term in quotes. Okay. All right, fine. It's possible that a word search of your document will not turn that phrase up, but you do say that in your book. You don't use those three words. But what difference does it make? You are saying that you buy your way into Harvard and you buy your way through it. Anyway, it's a perfect example of one of the many reasons why you don't do this, why you don't write a letter defending your own book when it's been reviewed at 5-page length in the New Yorker by Adam Gopnik. You count your blessings and you move on. You stay silent unless the author has made a factual mistake. And you don't mention one. You say that I don't think this, I don't believe this. I repeat throughout the book that I don't think this, that I think otherwise, and then you state something almost identical to the summary that you're alluding to in Gopnik's piece. But you saying it is not the text. You call it that. You say, I'm willing to chalk up these divergences from the text to rhetorical flourishes, but you've talked about divergences from your own summary. You haven't talked about divergences from the text. Anyway, it's a perfect example of why you shouldn't do this. And we'll see. The New Yorker doesn't do running battles in their letters pages. So unfortunately, Adam Gopnik will not, if he writes a response, it'll be to his editor, where this whole thing should have taken place. His response won't be in the letters column. That's a shame, because I'd like to read it. It would probably be pretty stinging, and maybe even along the lines of what I'm saying, which is, again, really disturbing. But there was also a poem, believe it or not. I did not read a poem for Poetry Thursday, so we're going to read a poem today. Believe it or not. I'm not reading it because I especially liked it or especially hated it. I just want to know what you think of it. This is by Diane Seuss. And it's long, but we'll go through it because we only have one book package to do. It's called Romantic Poetry. And I should add ahead of time that it's only nominally a poem. It is, once again, as we've seen countless times, arrhythmic, staggered prose. Something isn't a poem just because you call it a poem. It has to be a poem. It has to fit at least some definition of a poem, and this doesn't. But we're going to go through it anyway. We just have to concede. That's never going to not be true. So now that the TV is gone and the music has been hauled away, it's just me here, and the muffling silence a spider wraps around a living morsel. And at times, often, the unbearable. I bear it, though, just like you. Long ago, I bore a suitcase filled with books, bore it far on city streets, to sell, I guess, at some used book place, one of those doorways down steps into dankness and darkness, the scent of mildewed, dog-eared, fingered pages, the suitcase big and square and sharp-cornered, covered in snakeskin, bought at Goodwill for $1, knowing I had some traveling to do, some lugging, and I was right. What books I sold I do not know. Maybe that's where modern poetry went. The cover cherry red and blossom white. I can see its spine in my mind's eye, pointing downward beneath the dank and the dark to the water tunneling out of the city and making its way to the river. Poems sliding down the book's spine into water, the shock of the cold and dank, down where my uterine lining, my blood and cast-off ovulations, cast-off fetal tissue swims. Below the city, the micro-dead ride modern poems like swan boats in the park. From the park to the river to the sea. I'm thinking now of P.J. Harvey and Nick Cave, balladeers, lovers, Vida and Virginia, Frank O'Hara and Vincent Warren. I guess straight people are never lovers. Somehow we ride our lost loves out to sea, or they ride us. It doesn't matter. Poet or poem or reader, the same ectoplasm. The modern, in time, becomes antique, and the stone faces of the dead convert to symbols ripe for smashing. Come to think of it, symbols are terrible. As the tyrant shouted to the masses, part of his brainwashing campaign, I know it and you know it too. I was 23 when I sold off modern poetry and sailed to Italy seeking romantic poetry, which was at one time modern, and found my way to Rome and Keats's death room, his deathbed, a facsimile. Everything he touched was burned to kill what killed him. I lifted his death mask from its nail, cradled it, closed my eyes and kissed his lips, until the plaster warmed and stained his face with the lipstick on my lips. Red was the cover of modern poetry. The color of the droplets of arterial blood he coughed onto his sheets and viewed by candlelight. Then he knew he was done for. His death warrant, he called it. After those many kisses over his face and eyes, and the reticulated eyelashes, cold and tangled, my lips were blossom white, my face chalked, like I'd caught something from him. And I don't just mean consumption. Though my lungs burned for years, they still burn. This is the danger of the ecstasy of kissing the dead or dying poet on the mouth. The disease you'll catch, well, it changes you. The tingle in the spine, the erotic charge, will be forever married to poetry's previous incarnations. It's why marriage itself never worked for me. I kept wanting to get to the part where death parts us and I could find myself again. Keats made such a compact corpse, only 5 feet tall, shorter than Prince, and intricately made. Always he was working it out, the meaning of suffering, the world's, his own, the encounter with beauty, nearly synonymous with suffering. How empathy could extinguish him, and he could set down the suitcase at last and finally deliver to himself, distinct as the waves in his hair and the bridge of his nose. How auspicious, rare, lush, bizarre, kinky, transcendent, romantic, to be young, just 23, and to cradle him in my arms as we listened to the burbling water of the Fontana della Barcaccia from the open window. So I think we can agree, although that's not poetry, it's very good. It's very powerful. I especially love that bit about how suffering is equated with the encounter with beauty. The encounter with beauty, nearly synonymous with suffering. Some of the gimmickry I could do without. The stupid play on bear and bore, for instance. At times, often the unbearable. I bear it, though, just like you. Long ago, I bore a suitcase full of books. It's two different kinds. One is, I just can't bear it. The other is, I was carrying something. It's ham-handed. It's look at me, Ma. Look at how clever I am. But there's not much of that in this poem. I hate the modern blue-haired Twitter politics signaling, the virtue signaling of you sold a book called modern poetry. Your poem is called romantic poetry, but the couples that you come up with are regimentedly gay. It's not that they were the first couples that came to mind. It's that you can't not do that. That was the one time where the sharp elbow of the modern world could be felt through the plush velvet of this poem. But I really liked it. Otherwise, I really liked it. And there's the last thing we want to talk about here is that Joan Akukela does a long piece about the new translation of Manzoni's The Betrothed, which I haven't read yet. It's nice and long. Unfortunately, Alessandro Manzoni cannot write in and complain. I tell you. I love those sorts of things in The New Yorker. Considering the large amount of so-so mezza garbage that's come out in 2022. I kind of wish that The New Yorker had decided in March or April to just do long literary pieces like that. The literary people that you have attached to The New Yorker, that they have in there on a very short list of people that they can call for something, like Adam Gopnik or John Akukela or anybody else, would be just as happy with the season's big reissue of some book by a dead author, as opposed to Jedediah Purdy writing a persnickety, self-important, preening letter that wins him no credit, that does him no favors. So I'll have to see. I'm especially interested in it because, of course, Sam Sachs at the Wall Street Journal also did a long standalone piece considering that new translation of The Betrothed, which is always a perfect example to let the critic talk about the work. Most of the critics, I don't know about Joan Akukela, but most critics who will talk about this new translation of The Betrothed cannot read it in the original. And most of them, on a deadline, just having learned 2 weeks ago from their editor that they have the space and the go-ahead to write about this new translation of a 1,000-page Italian epic, are not going to go to the Penguin Classic translation. They're going to find a copy of the Strand and dutifully read their way through that before they read the new one. So they're not even going to do line comparisons of English translations. They're just going to talk about the experience, the atmosphere of this one right in front of you. And there's nothing completely wrong with that, right? There's nothing much wrong with that at all. That's how most readers are going to approach this new translation of The Betrothed. Most of them will not have read it before in any language. Most of them will not be able to read it in the original. Most of them will not go and fish out the Penguin Classic from their shelf that's been sitting there unread for 35 years. Most of them won't do that. So it's good that a critic does that, and it's neat when I get to read two critics back to back. I don't know who else is doing that. I think somebody else is doing a Betrothed piece for the New Republic, and I think that's coming out this coming week. I forget exactly who the name is, but we shall see. I'm always up for it. Always up for it. And that leaves the package. I don't believe that I've forgotten the mail for the mail haul. we have one package. There'll probably be others, but we have one for today. What have we got here? Oh, I think we've already seen this. Haven't we? Haven't we already seen this thing? I thought we did. Well, let's see. Let's go through this. This is a December release, mid-December, December 13th. No one will be reviewing books in the week of December 13th. Maybe the New York Times. The New York Times has a daily book review sometimes. The Wall Street Journal, maybe the Washington Post. Most of their people will be thinking only about traveling for 2 weeks. Most of their people will be gone by December 13th. Their year's best books, their lists will have already come out, so you don't have a chance of getting on that list. I agree that those lists are of secondary concern because the only list that's worth paying attention to along those lines is my own, which will be appearing on under the Steve Reads banner on stevedonoghue.com in the first 2 weeks of December, and will be the definitive list of the best and worst books of 2022. The definitive list. It will be probably 12 or 13 categories, 10 books apiece, including worst fiction and worst nonfiction. But the others have to try. They have to try to get your attention. But anyway, I think we've seen this already. This is by Keigo Higashino, and it is A Death in Tokyo. Very nice looking. Very nice. This is translated, I assume. It's translated by Giles Murray, and this is the author of The Devotion of Suspect X, which I read and liked. So let's see what this doomed to be ignored book is all about. The author is one of Japan's most popular, biggest-selling fiction authors, as well known as Stephen King or James Patterson in his home country. You who are in Japan, feel free to let me know. Is that publisher hyperbole or is that true? I'd love to know. Higashino burst onto the U.S. scene with his 2011 publication of The Devotion of Suspect X, which was shortlisted for the Egg Award for Best Novel. I read it and really liked it. I think it made my mystery list that year, but we weren't talking in 2011. So we never saw it on this channel, I don't think. This book is a mind-bending sequel to Malice and Newcomer, in which Tokyo police detective Kiyochiro Kaga finds himself forced to try and make sense of a most unusual murder. In the Nihonbashi district of Tokyo, an unusual statue of a Japanese mythic beast, a kirin, stands guard over the district from the classic Nihonbashi Bridge. I guess maybe that's what we're looking at? Late at night, the body of a murdered man, stabbed in the chest, is found on the bridge under the statue of the winged beast. However, that was not the crime scene. The man was killed a few hundred yards away, and his body moved to that position. The same night, a young man named Yashima is injured in a car accident attempting to flee from the police. Found on him is the wallet of the murdered man. The two have no known connection. Tokyo police detective Kaga is assigned to the team investigating the murder, and Kaga's investigation takes him down dark roads and into unknown paths to uncover what really happened and why. This book demonstrates why its author is the defining master of mind-bending puzzle mystery. I don't know how much of a puzzle it will be. I just recently read a Golden Age murder mystery in which one of the characters actually says whoever moves the body is the guilty party. You know, that happens all the time in murder mysteries, all the time, where a body is found somewhere and then it is determined either forensically or by a Sherlock Holmes savant at the scene that the person didn't die there. Usually because they would bleed out in the location, and they didn't. Usually the location is scrupulously free of blood. And that gimmick happens all the time. And then it's a question not only of who killed the person, but of who moved the body. And someone in a murder mystery that I read just the other day sort of cynically mentioned that the person who moved the body either killed the person or knows who did. And as soon as I read that line, that was like 2 weeks ago that I read that, as soon as I read that line, I was racking my brains to think of an example of a murder mystery I've read where that isn't true. I couldn't off the top of my head come up with anything. But this comes out in mid-December. You murder fans, this sounds really good. And The Devotion of Suspect X was really good. I don't know that I read, this pub sheet mentions books called Malice and Newcomer. I don't know that I read those. But I read The Devotion of Suspect X and really liked it. So I will definitely read this. I don't know what I can do for it review-wise. But you know that it's out there. It's coming out as a hardcover, I assume? Yes, it'll be a $28 hardcover. So if your library doesn't have a copy, or if you're flush with money and you want a new murder mystery, maybe a new author, if you haven't ever discovered this author before, you now know that this is coming. So that is our mail for today. One murder mystery, but very promising. I won't be reading it tonight. This is not a case where the mail shapes my TBR, as it were, my nightly reading, because it's too far away. I'll read this when I get the finished copy, or I'll read it on the 1st of December, but I've got all of October. I'm still up to my eyeballs in October books, and October is halfway spent. And then there's November, which is, fairly crowded. It's fairly crowded. I've got a lot of big release fiction to read, for Pete's sake, let alone all the genre stuff. So I won't be reading this right away, but maybe you will want to put it on your list. So that is it. That is our mail haul for today. One book and one magazine. So we still managed to get to 30 minutes, but I'm going to wrap this up for now, and I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.